Welcome to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my co-host, Sarah Yanosy.
Hi, Sandy. Hi, everyone.
Sarah and I spent the last 25 years working with leaders around the US and around the world to build trauma-informed workplaces and to transform service delivery for nonprofit, government, and for-profit organizations that exist for the purpose of helping people. In this podcast, we share our insights and our experiences and knowledge to inspire leaders and other professionals to put these ideas into practice.
This is our third season of Creating Presence, and we've talked a bit in our past episodes about collective learning, mostly in the context of collective trauma. And today we want to focus on the ways that organizations can develop what we're calling learning disabilities, organizational learning disabilities, and the particular dangers involved in silencing dissent.
These days, you actually may frequently hear that term that Sarah just used, organizational learning. What does that mean, really? It's the idea that organizations, particularly today, exist in a pretty constant state of interaction with their external environment. And of course, the external environment changes all the time. Just remember what everybody went through and what all organizations went through during the pandemic. So organizations have to learn in order to adapt. So the concept implies that organizational learning, like learning for you and I, is both a cognitive thing and an emotional thing and a social thing, that it involves capturing and storing and diffusing knowledge within the organization. So it's got to be then the product of certain organizational arrangements and decisions that are made. And it often involves really looking at fundamental assumptions and values, and that can be pretty uncomfortable.
Yeah, traditionally, organizational learning starts at the individual level. So, one person or several people take on information and then it gets diffused. That knowledge gets diffused to other parts of the organization. And the end result of organizational learning is adaptation and value creation. But the pace of change that's happening in the world in general has radically increased. And so the biggest threat is complacency, contentment with the status quo. And that's really both dangerous and unproductive.
Yeah, it's missing really what one organizational consultant named John Connor has pointed out, that there needs to be a sense of urgency. And that's really rare, he said, and immeasurably important in a rapidly changing world. It requires leadership up and down the whole organizational hierarchy and a recognition and appreciation for the challenges involved in change. But so you have to have this somebody, or hopefully a lot of people, urging on this powerful desire to move and make a difference. And from our point of view, that is especially important around all of this trauma-informed knowledge, that it is really urgent that everybody understand about adversity and trauma, and that really hasn't happened. Urgent activity that is alert, fast, focused, relentless, and continuously overcoming, doing things that are irrelevant, is really, really vital to this kind of organizational learning and change. So it's this sense of urgency that we need in all human services because people's lives are at stake. So the developmental trajectory of every child is being determined in the moment by the events and the people in their lives, even more than by, for the most part, by their genes.
And unfortunately, in addition to like that constant rapid change, we also face chronic stress. And that chronic stress can produce what's been referred to as a false sense of urgency, right? So you were talking about how important urgency is, but often what chronic stress does is it creates this misguided sense of urgency. And that's what creates what we call organizational learning disabilities. That's when organizational members become committed to a pattern of behavior and escalate that commitment, even when these patterns are obsolete or worse, destructive to the organization's well being. So the urgency really becomes to fight change or maintain what's become obsolete. And so we're suggesting that human service delivery systems, at least the ones that we're working with, but we suspect as a whole, have developed learning disabilities as the result of their exposure to this chronic and unrelenting stress.
Yeah, I think that's at the heart of so many challenges today. I just did a comment for my university, asked me to comment on a paper that came out from UCLA about how um, closely tied the experience of childhood adversity is to later adult chronic illnesses. And the point I made in my response was that, yeah, this is really important research, and it builds on a knowledge base that's been around for 25 years that the public largely doesn't know about. And why? Because of these problems with learning under stress. And our communities have been under stress now for a long time. So there are difficulties learning. And then what happens in organizations and the people and whole organizations develop state-dependent learning so that they only are taking in things that are immediately relevant to the stresses that they're under. And then after a while, things don't work. So people are likely to develop a sense of what's called learned helplessness, that nothing we do really matters, and not be able to really integrate this really vital knowledge and information that they need to know.
Some other things that happen are that tacit knowledge, right? The knowledge that we gain from experience doesn't get replaced when people leave. And even worse, explicit knowledge is sometimes falsified, right? So we see people actually spreading misinformation. That results too in self-fulfilling prophecies, deterioration of memory, which we refer to as organizational amnesia, the tendency to filter out trauma and use collective denial, right? So that sometimes sounds like, oh, it wasn't that bad, or I don't think it really happened that way. And sort of the story changes over time. We also see reenactment of failed strategies. What you and I have talked about is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different outcome, which, is sort of colloquially referred to as the definition of insanity. And then also denial, just straight up denial that bad things are happening. And I think climate change is a really good example of this, the collective denial about what's actually happening to our planet.
Yeah, I think it's important for our listeners to realize we are specializing in talking about the organizational level, but really we also could be easily talking about the whole society, the whole social level, that as you and I have been talking about, neither of us recall a time when our country has been so polarized as it is now. Even worse than during the era I remember clearly, during the Vietnam War, that we're much more unable to come to any mutual ground right now. And we like to think that we make individual decisions and think independently, but actually that's largely not what happens. And that's really worrisome because we know from studies of group psychology for many years that when people in countless cases, like-minded people, have discussions with their peers, they tend to end up thinking a more extreme version of what they thought before they started to talk to other people. And that's how the polarization happens.
Yeah, and we've heard about this in the context of social media echo chambers, right?
Mhm.
Like once your algorithm decides what you think, all you get are those same messages. But that happens too in human interactions and particularly in organizations. When a majority of a group initially leans towards one position, even when that position is really extreme, their consensus tends to influence other people in the group who hold a more moderate position. And then the whole group moves closer towards that extreme position.
And when that happens, people who hold in that group a minority position, they often silence themselves or otherwise have really very little weight in the group deliberations. And so the results can be what have been called hidden profiles, important information that's not being shared in the group. And group members often have information, but don't discuss it because they're afraid of being intimidated and bullied by the extremist point of view. But the result is that they're much more likely to get really inferior decisions.
Yeah. Do you have an example of this?
Yeah, I have a story that actually happened. I was consulting with an outpatient organization that had a whole bunch of different programs, and they decided they wanted to integrate their overall system. So to do that, I started out by urging them to review their long history. So one of the conflicts that surfaced was it was really odd. It was a non-specific fear and suspicion of one department, the financial department. And it didn't seem to make any sense in terms of their present operations because they weren't having any particular financial problems. So the whole place was divided into the financial people who were over on one side and everybody else. So I thought, what in the world is this about? So I asked the people who had worked there the longest to form an inner circle to talk about the past, and everybody else sat in a circle around them. And what surface was a part of their history that most people in the room didn't know anything about. It was part of what we've called tacit memory, that was still playing a role, but it was unconnected to actually any context in the present. 30 years before, now 30 years, 3 decades before, there had been a really serious financial crisis that had almost caused the institution to shut its doors. So financial specialists, one of whom was still in the department, were called in to attempt to rescue the place. At the time, everybody felt enormous pressure, but particularly, of course, the newly hired financial people, the burden that was on their shoulders. So the organizational grapevine, which is always present, warned everybody about staying away from finance and some personal vignettes about short-tempered responses from the people in finance at the time reinforced the warning. So although the situation had long since righted itself, largely because they did a good job, the word on the street was still stay away from finance. The current leader had known nothing about this piece of the history. So hadn't been able to do anything to connect the misapprehension that targeted one lonely, isolated department until this fragment of organizational memory was retrieved and made conscious. And therefore, everything changed. People stopped picking on the finance department.
Wow.
It's amazing to see.
It is. And these hidden profiles have so much power. Um, Another thing that comes to mind around, what drives this organizational learning disability development is about confidence too. So what makes it worse is that when people who have really extreme views are speaking, they do that with a lot of confidence that they're right. And that then kind of it trickles down to the other people who are listening. And by virtue of their confidence, the other people are sort of like, okay, well, I guess I have confidence in them too. They seem like they really know what they're talking about. And so they sort of go along with that and also then become more extreme in their beliefs. And by contrast, people who don't have that same level of confidence or aren't really sure what to think or have more moderate views, they are swept up in it. And so the result is that the increased confidence can increase extremism as well. And this is particularly likely to happen if the person who is coming across as so confident but extreme has a position of authority or higher status in the group. And the really bad part of this is that all of these effects are invisible to the participants. So this is all happening kind of underneath the surface. And as other people continue to then reinforce that extreme position, the person's confidence grows based on further agreement. Not necessarily because there's like evidence that they're right, but because they're kind of getting this emotional information that, yes, okay, I must be right. And also, nobody's challenging me. So that's even further emotional evidence that they're right. So over time, this group polarization can get more extreme and have really detrimental effects on the organization because those who have more moderate opinions just stop contributing or they leave the group altogether. And then as a result, those extreme positions could get cemented, and they dominate the organizational climate. And these extreme positions can really interfere with healthy organizational adaptation or change, right? The more extreme we are, the less open we are to seeing something from a different perspective.
And there's probably people there, right, who are in some way part of the group or listening, and they're likely to keep quiet about their reservations because they don't want to get in trouble. They don't want to incur the disfavor of the high status speaker. So instead, they silence themselves because they don't want to cause internal tension. And then, of course, then by seeing their views further corroborated, like you were saying, and not contradicted by these people, the first speakers then become even more confident and one might say arrogant and more extreme. So groups that are highly bonded through emotional ties, and I think we need to emphasize this is not about reasoning. This is not about thought. This is about emotions in a group that we may or may not be aware of. So those vulnerable to those emotional ties are particularly susceptible then to polarizations because the tendencies are so strong to just agree with each other. And given the pressures within a group that push for conformity and group polarization, which we like to deny and pretend aren't really affecting us while they are, it may take really a lot of courage to dissent. But given these same pressures, it's vital that people use their own perceptions when they see something they believe to be problematic within an organization. Otherwise, disaster really may unfold.
I really appreciate your point about the emotional ties. And as you were talking, I was thinking about how I have really had to practice dissenting in our conversations when our team meets because I feel really connected to you and our other team members. I have like great affection and respect. And so when I see something that I think, that I have a different opinion about, it really it's hard for me to say it, because I don't have the same sense of confidence that I have in you and some of our other folks who've been there longer. So making that a practice, and you have been really wonderful about kind of asking for dissenting opinions, and that's a really important part of good leadership. But when we're talking about dissent, we're defining it as expressing disagreement or giving voice to contradictory opinions about organizational practices and policies. And it's interesting what triggers people to come forward and speak about what they're seeing and kind of voice dissent is most commonly related to unjust treatment, organizational change or implementation of those changes, decision making, inefficient work practices or processes, roles and responsibilities, and resources. Sometimes too, unethical practices, performance evaluations, and things that might create danger. So those do tend to spark people to voice dissent.
Yeah, and creating environments that support direct and open dissent are really critically important for a number of reasons. First one is that people are more satisfied in their workplace when they feel that they can freely voice their opinions and be heard. Participation increases people's satisfaction and commitment. Workers sense whether dissent is acceptable in the culture, and then they determine their own reactions based on their perceptions of whether it's acceptable or not. But most importantly, dissent serves as corrective feedback within an organization that can really avert total disaster. But to be useful, it has to be direct, and therefore the conditions that promote that kind of dissent within an organizational culture have to be conducive to free speech without retaliation.
Yeah, we know that dissent is really useful, but it is rarely welcomed in the workplace. And there's some empirical data that shows that employees often feel compelled to remain silent in the face of concerns or problems. And that has been termed organizational silence. In one study, the researchers interviewed employees from 22 organizations around the US, and 70% of them indicated that they felt afraid to speak up about issues or problems that they encountered at work. These undiscussables covered a wide range of areas, including decision making, procedures, managerial incompetence, pay inequity, organizational inefficiencies, and poor performance.
Yeah, the silencing of dissent is, one could argue, even less welcome in environments that are under conditions of chronic stress. One investigator who characterized organizational expression as an enduring problem of fundamental tension between the individual and the collective, and noted that such tension tends to be resolved not by listening to the individual bringing up the issues, but in favor of whatever is in the experienced best interest of the organization at the time. So for managers, particularly those under stressful conditions, dissent may be perceived as a threat to the unified action that they feel compelled needs to be taking. And as a result, they use escalating control measures to repress any dissent that's felt to be dangerous to that unity and therefore connected to survival threats. And this encourages more and more narrowing of input from the world outside the organization, or even within the organization in different groups that may have become polarized, kind of like what's happening in the whole country today.
We've talked so much about the importance of social connections in our organizations and relationships, but in some ways there are these like hidden dangers that emerge too. Um, and this narrowing that you're talking about, it also encourages rivalries and splitting off of dissenting subgroups within the organization. And that can sometimes come out in passive aggression or open subversion around the organizational goals. So as group cohesion then starts to wane, right? Like when subgroups get connected to each other, but not to the larger whole, leaders start to perceive that they need to take more controlling action, right? So they sort of have this mentality that, we need to be more controlling because things are starting to feel too chaotic, and these internal fighting uh experiences are getting disruptive. And they mistakenly think that being more controlling is then, how they're going to make it better. Another way that they think they can make it better is by externalizing the threat, right? Kind of looking for some outside, person or entity to create as a common enemy, and sort of use the like, oh, well, we can't allow internal fighting when we have to rally everyone against this common enemy. And sometimes that's like regulators or competitors. Um, but then what really happens is we are doing like a lot of damage by silencing the dissent as a way to, kind of create cohesion, because what gets silenced is the minority opinion.
Right. And then the suppression of whatever the dissenting minority voice is has negative consequences. As dissent is silenced, vital information flow is really impeded or completely stopped. As a result, the quality of analyzing a problem and making decisions about the problems deteriorates even further. If this cycle isn't stopped and the organization is allowed then the opportunity to recuperate, the result may be an organization that just becomes ever more rigid, repetitious, and ultimately really destructive and even suicidal, as do many chronically stressed people.
Exactly. And our listeners may be really hearing this and thinking like, I think I might work in a place like this. So after the break, we will discuss some of the skills that we use in creative presence that can help us move from debate to dialogue as a way of preventing this silencing of dissent. We'll be back after these messages.
In a world with trauma, adversity, and mental health deficits, your organization may be feeling the effects in its culture. Recognizing the need for safe, productive, and values-aligned organizations, Creating Presence can help to develop a healthy, biocratic organization. In the Creating Presence training model, your entire staff will learn to value human elements that characterize organizations, learn values that are solution-based and supportive, and implement new skills which will create capable leaders to meet the needs of staff and clients. For more information, go to www.creatingpresence.net. Creating Presence is managed by Lakeside, your resource for trauma-responsive care.
Welcome back to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my co-host, Sarah Yanosy. And we're going to continue our discussion about organizational learning disabilities by talking about dialogue. Dialogue instead of debate.
Dialogue is a special form of conversation that goes beyond normal interaction, or at least what we think of as normal today. From the ancient Greeks to Native American tribal councils and Quaker practices, the capacity for dialogue's been recognized as a vital way of maintaining a peaceful community and arriving at better solutions and decisions.
The best known descriptions of dialogue were presented by a quantum physicist, a really famous quantum physicist named David Bohm. According to Bohm, dialogue encourages a group to learn collectively and produce new ways of thinking together. He thought that communication in human groups becomes blocked because of the basic cultural or subcultural assumptions that each person brings to any conversation.
Yeah, he said groups of 20 to 40 people can produce a microcosm of the larger world, and that they'll create their own microculture along with their own shared meaning, language, and customs if they're given the time to do that.
Yeah, so to be productive, a dialogue has to occur in an atmosphere of egalitarianism and in the absence of coercion, coercive influences. And it's possible, therefore, only where there is mutual trust and respect, requires deep listening with empathy, and involves bringing all of those underlying assumptions out in the open without judgment, without criticism. Just, that's the way things are.
Yeah, you started by highlighting the difference between dialogue and debate. And dialogue is actually the opposite of debate in a lot of ways. In a debate, the objective is to win, to vanquish your opponent. And that really sets up a win-lose situation, where the objective of dialogue is to find common ground and to establish like a shared meaning. Dialogue's also different from discussion because discussion also is really about a win-lose conversation. So we're sort of parsing words, but it's an important distinction.
Yeah, in the typical workplace, people from a wide variety of subcultures are likely to need to interact and share a common purpose. Otherwise, they'll never be able to think together and work out the complex problems and conflicts that will inevitably arise. So, as David Bohm described the process, dialogue works best with about 20 to 40 people seated facing one another in a single circle when that's possible. He believed that smaller groups just are not diverse enough to reveal the tendencies that are there, and will generally emphasize a much more familiar personal and family roles and relationships. And the 20 to 40 people creates a different form of group interaction.
He described these 8 steps. So I'm going to name what they are. He said one is state the reason for the conversation or dialogue, state the intention to resolve the conflict, name the difficult problem clearly, avoid ascribing blame, take responsibility, invite engagement and help, ask for different points of view, and ask how to move forward.
Some other tips he talks about for moving from debate to dialogue is about listen with the question. So, what is it that I can agree with? And what is it they need me to hear that's driving our differences?
Yeah, he's really kind of talking about an openness. But a third suggestion, one that you and I have talked about in creating presence, is using a devil's advocate, like actually assigning that role to a particular person who volunteers for it. And since dissent is so important for good decisions and, good decision making processes, it's really helpful to invite that role. But because many people in an organization find it too frightening or risky to, you know, dissent. So it can be a really great value to a team to ask someone at the meeting to play the role of the devil's advocate. And traditionally, this means somebody who takes a position that they don't necessarily agree with, but just for the sake of argument, they're going to seek to identify weaknesses in a plan or consider unintended consequences. And that is their job. And then that job is for the benefit of the rest of the group.
Yeah, and it helps the entire group to either improve and refine their plan or abandon it altogether. Either way, it it paves the way for a much greater frequency of complex decision making. When engaged in a difficult group decision with your team, or when you suspect that people are really not thinking through a problem or are engaged in group think, then really consider asking somebody to volunteer to be a devil's advocate. Their instructions are that they have to spot every problem with the possible decision and to express contentious opinions in order to provoke debate or test the strength of the arguments, even though they may actually agree with the group process. Now you may be thinking that in your team, you already have someone who routinely plays that role.
Yeah, absolutely. So another way to do this is through a process that we've talked about in previous podcasts, and one that we use in creating presence, called the 6 hats. That's De Bono's 6 hats technique, where the process is that everyone plays a role, the same role as we have the discussion, in evaluating the facts, feelings, judgments, all of that kind of stuff. So in 6 hats, this would be, the pink hat, where we're talking about all of the possible negative positions about a decision. So for a group to be effective, it's best not to have people in their inflexible, predictable roles. It's much easier for the group to stay in groupthink and simply ignore someone who's always taking the same position over and over. So whether it's using the 6 hats technique or designating someone as the devil's advocate who isn't usually that person, we can kind of break that groupthink process.
Yeah, as a leader, you really want to avoid having a permanent minority group or a permanent minority voice that's going to interfere with the creativity and innovation in the group. So another strategy is to breathe and be silent. Allow for the processing of emotions and processing of what has been said. It's also really important to understand the physiology of dialogue and dissent. So it means tuning in to what's happening in your body, asking everybody to do that. Heart rate, breathing rate, how your body is affecting your thinking.
It's really hard for me when I'm in this kind of situation. And what's been helpful, when I've tuned into my body and I'm realizing, like, oh, somebody just said something about an idea that I'm really attached to, and I am reacting to that, and I'm noticing my heart rate and my face is getting red, and my ears are starting to get hot. I I try to use a cognitive process of, like, really focusing on integration, right? Because my life's work is about trauma, and recovery from trauma is about integration, that's very meaningful for me. So I feel like, when somebody is adding a dissenting opinion, instead of allowing myself to feel attacked or frustrated or angry, I mean, I let that pass through. And then I really try to think about it as, like, okay, they're putting a puzzle piece down. And my job is to try to help find a matching piece, like a piece, a part of the puzzle where this will fit, because my reaction is to want to take the puzzle piece and throw it off the table completely. But really thinking about, that integration is helpful for me in kind of using this process.
This conversation is also making me think back to our segment on racial trauma and how the Center for Community Organizations published recommendations about dismantling white supremacy by doing something different. Two of their key ideas were to challenge the right to comfort and the fear of conflict. The right to comfort is about understanding that discomfort is at the root of all growth and learning. Its presence is often signaling the need for deep self-reflection. So We should welcome discomfort as much as we can. And part of that is tuning into what your body's doing, because when you're uncomfortable, your body is also registering some kind of distress. The fear of conflict is about distinguishing between being impolite and bringing up difficult issues. So, learning to hold truth-telling conversations as a team and helping each other feel heard in those moments, and unlearning attitudes around so-called acceptable ways of calling attention to painful truths. It's also, I think, really useful to draw on Ken Hardy's work, the privileged and subjugated task model, or what he calls PAST, P period A period S period T period model. He identifies 5 tasks for each of the parties involved in that kind of a dialogue.
Yeah, and when we're thinking about how when, groups come together and we want a diversity of opinions, it's important to keep in mind that we are living in a racialized society. And so thinking about, silencing dissent in general really also requires us to think about the context of racial inequality. So the back to Ken Hardy, the 5 tasks of the privileged are: number 1, differentiating between intentions and consequences. And that means, like, when someone is injured by something that you've said, as a person in a privileged position, your job is to recognize that that happened, even if it's not what you intended, right? So a lot of times people will react defensively and like, oh, I didn't mean that, you misunderstood me. But really kind of holding the um, capacity for recognizing that how something was received is more important than what was intended. The second one is to avoid negation of subjugated conversations and disclosures. So that means really validating and using reflective listening, acknowledging that a point or perspective wasn't one that might have been considered, rather than dismissing it as unworthy of consideration. The third is avoiding reactive reflexes, what Ken Hardy calls developing thick skin, as a way of avoiding that defensiveness or shutting down conversations where discomfort arises. And this has been hard for me, right? I'm a white woman in my 50s. And so I show up and a lot of experience and a lot of education. I recognize that I show up in a privileged position in a lot of conversations that I have. And this idea of like trying to avoid reactive, reflexive, uh, reactions has been hard. But I think about often, I was a swimmer. And so for me, when I take something personally and, my skin is not as thick as I want it to be, I really try to remind myself like, okay, this is not a me personal thing. This is really about what I'm swimming in. This is I represent what I'm swimming in. And that's been helpful for me in kind of developing that thick skin. Avoid the issuance of prescriptions. So that looks like telling people, what you need to do is this, or, kind of acting as if you have the answers rather than responding with vulnerable disclosures, right? And that's what Ken Hardy recommends instead. So what that might sound like for me is like, I'm really troubled that you had this experience and that I contributed to it. And I can see that this is a blind spot for me. So these are some of the ways that we can, kind of verbalize and bring these recommendations into practice. And then the last one is to avoid speaking from the knowledgeable, neutral, objective expert position, right? So being aware of your racial self and your identity in conversations, recognizing your position of privilege or authority, even sometimes recognizing yourself as part of the problem. right? And again, for me, not necessarily because I'm a bad person or that's what I'm intending or any of that, but because that's what I'm swimming in. That's what that's what's coming through.
Yeah, I find it really difficult as well, having been, through the whole era, because I'm older, of a different generation of the whole civil rights movement and and being a woman and even though I'm a white woman and a physician, never really feeling very privileged. So it's
Yeah.
hard. It's hard to recognize the reality of that. And then there are also the tasks of the subjugated, which are specific ways of engaging in dialogue with an awareness of the wounds of othering that lead to reenactment of specific roles related to racial trauma and are intended to disrupt those roles. So challenge, silencing, and voicelessness. This happens through using I statements as a way of reclaiming and asserting your value and sense of self. Regulating and rechanneling rage. It's about committing to attacking ideas, not people. So in creating presence, we describe this as distinguishing between task conflict and interpersonal conflict. Engaging in a process of exhaling. This Ken Hardy describes as say what you mean what you say. Cease and desist caretaking of the privileged. Give space for feeling and learning for the other person, even if that means that they may experience discomfort and that you also might experience discomfort. And maintain investment in the conversation. Refrain from analyzing what is being said, rather simply listen and allow your authentic reaction without disengaging.
Yeah, it's this work has been really powerful for me. And I started my social work career at Smith College and the university. Well, I'm sorry, the program, the social work program, had a mission of anti-racism, and so a lot of the work that was part of our learning experience was focused on um, social justice and really having these uncomfortable conversations, and those have to happen within the context of organizations who are doing trauma informed work as well. And I think it's been so inspiring for me to really recognize these overlaps between anti-racism work and trauma informed practice. And I want to kind of highlight some of those you know interconnections. So where Ken Hardy talks about having thick skin and regulating and rechanneling rage, right? One of these is a task of the privileged, and one is a task of the subjugated. And creating presence, this really connects so much with our skill of emotional volume plans, where we are saying, okay, this we see that this is important, and these are the tasks. Here's a strategy for actually doing that, right? Being able to recognize your own emotions and triggers, having a plan for managing them. So this skill helps us like put it into practice in a very real and practical way. He also talks about differentiating between intentions and consequences and avoiding speaking from a knowledgeable, neutral, objective perspective. For us in creating presence, we do this by teaching about disrupting reenactments, like really looking at that triangular relationship between victim, persecutor, and rescuer that happens in interpersonal trauma. Also, in trauma informed practice and creating presence specifically, we are focusing all the time on kind of recognizing that the past is informing the present all the time. We are always recreating what our experiences have been, right? Like for me, what I'm swimming in shows up in what I do. Um, Ken Hardy talks about challenging voicelessness and avoiding the negation of conversations and avoiding caretaking. In creating presence, we really offer some group engagement strategies, like really practical ways to make this stuff happen. Appreciative inquiry is one where we teach people about complaining in the positive and allowing solutions to emerge. And in changing thought habits, where we recognize complexity and the tendency for oversimplification, and we make a big point to distinguish between safety and comfort. We also do this in creating presence where we're talking about restorative justice and specifically about interactional justice, which we talked about in another episode of our podcast. Ken Hardy also talks about avoiding prescriptions. And in creating presence, we talk a lot about using complexity management skills. So the self framework, safety, emotions, loss, and future, right? A way of organizing things that are really complex into those four categories that align with problems that trauma can cause for us. Adapting leadership styles, right? Recognizing that leaders need to shift the way that they engage with the people they supervise based on a whole host of circumstances, and getting really clear about when and what those circumstances are. And finally, using the 6 hats and building consensus skills that we talk about in creating presence. All of these are ways that we use complexity management to try to support the tasks of the subjugated and the tasks of the privileged in alignment with Ken Hardy's work.
Yeah, it's exciting to recognize how so many of us are working in seemingly different spheres of social health, but we're seeing, understanding, and trying to affect change in our communities and society at the same time. We started today's episode by focusing on dissent, and it feels so relevant in this moment of profound political and social division to have strategies that engage different voices and that help us find some kind of common ground, especially because of what's at stake for our future, for us as individuals, managing the dynamics of our personal and professional relationships, and for us globally as we navigate.
Yes, Sandy, what have your experiences been recently with navigating some of these dynamics, personal, professional, in the context of this polarization that we're seeing?
Yeah, constantly challenging. I mean, it never seems to stop. You're going to be on one side of the polarized division, and it's really hard not to get very defensive, not to get very emotional, but to try to get in that middle ground of dialogue is hard. And then you need everybody to be willing to do a dialogue, to really look at each other's points of view. And it makes it, even when people are similar to each other, it makes it easier to do that because there are common assumptions. But when we're really different, and that's what Ken Hardy's work is really focused on, right? Then it makes it much more difficult because you have to find some common ground, and both parties have to be willing to find some kind of common ground. So, and it's emotionally arousing to tune into your body and feel how upset you get so easily, particularly during these times when everybody's really stressed out. It's quite challenging. What about you?
Yeah, I find that when I get into these conversations with people who are on a very different side of that polarization from me, I am not well served by using my listening time for creating my next argument. that's my vulnerability. That's like where I go. And instead, I have found that if I can really let those physical reactions happen, but really stay committed to listening, I can often find a point of convergence, or a point of agreement. And that feels where there's some real value that happens. And the ability to do some of that integration. And I think when we're talking about trauma and recognizing that all of us have been, really traumatized by the last 5 years minimum, maybe a lot more for many of us, right? It's helpful to think about how we as individuals in these conversations can do some of that integration work through our relationships. Thanks so much for listening to Creating Presence. Join us next week when Sandy and I will talk more about what it means to create a healthy society. You can reach us at creatingpresence.net or voiceamerica.com. See you next week.